Well, today I'm going to talk to you about love. And the story I'm going to share is not a rags to riches Cinderella love story between a king and a queen. But it is a love story, rather, that is between God and his people, the Israel nation. So open your Bibles with me, if you will, if you have them. We're going to be a lot of the time in the book of Esther. In chapter 1, we meet the first character of the story. His name is King Ahasuerus, or his Greek name is King Xerxes. He was a powerful man, and he reigned over a very vast kingdom. He reigned for 21 years over 127 different provinces that ranged from India to Ethiopia. So he was quite powerful. Now, none of us, absolutely none of us, would have wanted to live under King Xerxes' reign. He was very showy. He was famous for throwing big and elaborate parties. He was famous for alcohol, wars, and he liked to parade around women. So turn with me to chapter 1, and we're going to read beginning at verse 3. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials, and he invited all the military officers of Persia and Media, as well as the princes and nobles in the provinces. The celebration lasted for 180 days, a tremendous display of the opulent wealth of his empire and the pomp and splendor of his majesty. And when it was all over, the king gave a banquet for all the people, from the greatest to the least, who were in the fortress of Susa. It lasted for 7 days and was held in the courtyard of the palace garden. So what we see taking place here is King Xerxes called for a big party, a party that lasted 180 days. And this party was alcohol-fueled. After that, he was going to have a party that was going to be 7 days. So it was a big, elaborate party. Drop down to verse 10. On the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of the wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman. But when they conveyed the king's orders to Queen Vashti, she refused to come, and this made the king furious, and he burned with anger. So what we see here is the king, in his drunken state, is calling for the queen to come and wear her royal crown and parade around in front of all of the drunk men at the party. Now, Bible scholars believe that he was asking her to come and wear only her crown, nothing else. So he wanted her to parade around in front of the men with nothing on but her crown. Now, we know that this was not an honor. Women in this culture, in this day, they were looked at as objects. This was not an honor. He simply wanted to show her off to the men in the kingdom. And what did Queen Vashti say? She said no. She said no. She rejected it. Well, this created a great deal of turmoil in the kingdom for the men in the kingdom. So the king consults his advisors, and the advisors are very concerned that under Queen Vashti's example, the other women in the kingdom were going to not obey what their husbands wanted. So they were very concerned. And they advised the king to banish the queen. So she was out. He banished her. She was gone from the kingdom. So when the king came to his senses and the alcohol had worn off, he realized what he had done. And he missed the queen. Remember, she was beautiful. He missed her. So his attendants decided to set out and search the entire empire to find another replacement to find a beautiful queen. They said, "Let the king appoint agents in all the provinces to bring these beautiful young women into the royal harem at the fortress of Susa. And the young woman who most pleases the queen will be, or the king, will be queen instead of Vashti." So they're going to find a replacement. So next we're going to drop down to chapter 2. You can just kind of follow along with me in this story. In chapter 2, we meet a man by the name of Mordecai. Now, I love Mordecai, and just a little disclaimer, I feel like this book should have been called the Book of Mordecai, because in this story, Mordecai's the hero man to me, okay? So he was a Jewish man. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and he found himself living in Susa at the time because he was carried there, exiled there from Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. And next we get to meet Hadassah, an orphaned Jewish girl. She was Mordecai's cousin, and he adopted her as his very own daughter, and he was raising her. Now, Hadassah and Mordecai, they've endured heartache, and they have endured loss. They've lost loved ones. They've been taken from their home into captivity. They're over 700 miles away from their homeland, and they're living as foreigners in the land of Persia. But God, He's setting the stage. He's preparing the stage. You know, as Christians, we don't believe in coincidence. We believe in providence. And providence means that God is in control. He's in control. Psalm 37:23 says that the steps of the godly are directed by the Lord, and He delights in every detail of their lives. He delights in every single detail of your lives. He doesn't waste even the little tiny things. You know, like when you're late for an appointment and you finally get going and you're kind of upset because you're late, but on down the road there was an accident that took place, and you knew that if you would have been there, you'd have been in that. See, He delights in all the little tiny things. He is working things in us today that is for our good, and it'll be for His glory tomorrow. I'll share with you a personal story. I shared with you before that I spent over 10 years being really, really sick. And for those of you that don't know or never heard, I had an incurable bladder disease, and I was in tremendous pain. And my family would find me at times collapsed on the bathroom floor. There was times I would collapse on the cold garage floor, and I would just cry out to the Lord because I didn't know how I was going to get through the days. I couldn't see my way out of that. But what I never shared with you was, during that time, I wasn't the kind of mom that I really wanted to be. You know, when you're a young girl and you dream of being a mom, it's all you really want to be. And you picture yourself and the kind of mom that you're going to be. And you picture yourself what you want to do with your kids. Well, that's what I was doing. You know, my whole life I had pictured what I was going to be like. But yet when the time came, I found myself in this circumstance that I couldn't be what I dreamed of. I couldn't run through the yard with my boys. I couldn't play ball with them. I couldn't take them to a restaurant and eat. And I couldn't go on vacation. We couldn't leave because I was too sick. And I would cry out, me and my alone time with God, and I would say, I'm ruining my kids. Like, I'm ruining them. They're going to grow up and they're going to think that their childhood was horrible. And that's what I thought. But you know, I did what I could with them. I read to them. a lot of stories. We would act out Bible skits a lot. We had a swing set in the backyard, and we would sing, and I would push them on the swings, and we would sing and sing and sing. I think we sang all the time. Austin just told me last night that I have the most horrible voice that he's ever heard, but, and I do. Like, I would not grab the mic and sing to you. But I did a lot of singing with my kids. And I would push them on the swing set, and we had this song we would sing, like, I got the joy, joy, joy down in my heart. And if the devil doesn't like it, he can sit on a tack. And to make it fun, as their little butts would come back to me, I would pinch them. And they would say, do it again, So we did what we could. We did what we could. But what I found out through all of this is that God takes what we have, and he uses it for his good. It wasn't God that made me sick. No. That was Satan. But God saw that circumstance I was in, and he used it. He used it to bring good. And I can see it now, because I see it in Brady, who developed a love for music and a love for songwriting and a love for singing, and then he's able to worship God and lead us in songs. And I see it in Austin, because he was the little boy that would come back, and when I was collapsed, he would lay his hands on me, and he would declare healing into my body. And I believe that God was putting inside of him compassion that he uses today out in the community as a paramedic. So I know that God was in that circumstance, right in the midst of that with me. And he was saying, I'm going to use it for your benefit, to bring good for you, to bring good for your kids, and glory to me. And that's what he was doing. And this is what he's doing in the life of Hadassah. See, Hadassah, she was one of the 400 young girls, young virgins, that were rounded up out of all those provinces and taken to the king's palace. She is not where she wants to be. She's not in a circumstance that she wants to be in. It is not what she would have dreamed of. It is estimated that she was 15 years old. The king is 40. This is not a situation that a young girl would dream of. And it was not an honor. These girls, they were taken from their families, their lives, and their dreams are shattered. They're an object. They're finding themselves in a situation they never asked for, they never volunteered for. It was a contest. And after one night with the king, if he didn't choose them, they weren't sent back to their families to get married and have a family and have a husband. No, they were turned into the king's concubines. So Hadassah, I know, would not have chosen this situation for herself. And yet we see God at work through her life, because he is about to save and rescue and redeem his people. He's about to do something that'll be for her good and for his glory. Now, Mordecai, my favorite character in this, he gave her orders. And remember, she's 15. He said, do not let anyone know that you are a Jew. He was doing this to protect her. And he gave her a new name, and her new name is now Esther. So Mordecai was a sure man of God. This man was steadfast. This man had faith, and he walked in it. And every day, he would go to the palace gates outside the palace courtyard, and he would check to see how Esther was. He wanted to know that his adoptive daughter was okay. Every day he would check on her and see what was happening to her. Now go to chapter 2, verse 16. Eventually we see that Esther is taken to King Xerxes at the royal palace in early winter of the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than any other young woman. He was so delighted with her that he set the royal crown on her head and declared her queen. And to celebrate the occasion, he did what he always likes to do. he threw a great banquet in her honor. Around the same time, Mordecai became a palace official. Now, I believe he became a palace official because he's showing up there every day to see how she is, because persistence will get you somewhere. Being dedicated will be noticed. And he became a palace official. And one day when Mordecai was on duty, he overheard two men talking about killing the king. And he was able to get this information to Queen Esther, and she was able to stop the assassination. Because, see, Mordecai, he was willing to honor those that aren't living honorable lives. He honored this king that wasn't godly. He honored those who were above him, even when they were not living honorable lives. That's a lesson for us every single day of our lives. Now, next in the story, we meet the villain, because every good story has a villain. And we meet the villain, and his name is Haman. Haman had an explosive temper. He was promoted by the king to be the most powerful official in the empire. So when we put most powerful official along with explosive temper, that's not a good combination. Haman was the kind of man who was thirsty for more. He always wanted more and more and more for himself. He always wanted more authority. He was never satisfied. He always wanted more glory. This is the kind of man he was. And Haman, he did not care for Mordecai. That's putting it mildly. Actually, Haman hated Mordecai. You see, because all the other men in the empire, they would bow to Haman, but Mordecai wouldn't, because Mordecai would only bow to God. And Haman hated him. But what Haman actually hated was the God that was inside of him. Have you ever met someone and they just don't like you because they don't like who's inside of you? That happens. That's what was happening here. This was a spiritual war. And I know that because Haman was an Amalek. And in Exodus 17, verse 16, God said, "The Amalekites have raised their fist against the Lord's throne, so now the Lord will be at war with them, generation after generation." So you see, this was a spiritual battle that was taking place. The Bible tells us that when Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow, he was filled with fury. I mean, he was angry. He was angry. One night he goes home and he's telling his wife, "Oh, I can't stand that man. I can't stand Mordecai. He won't bow to me. He won't. I don't like him." I can just hear the words. And she was no better than Haman. As a matter of fact, I think she was probably worse, because here was her advice. Well, if you don't like him, build a big tall gallows and hang him on it. You're the most powerful man in the empire. Just get rid of him. Just hang him. And Mordecai thought, sounded pretty good. So he called men together, and he wanted a gallows that was going to be built 8 stories tall, because he wanted everyone in the land of Persia to be able to see that Mordecai was hanging. However, for Haman, that wasn't quite good enough. Remember, he's someone that always wants more power. So he thought that killing Mordecai just wasn't going to quite do it for him. He knew he was a Jew, so he wanted to kill all the Jews, all of them. Turn to chapter 3, verse 8. So Haman decides to approach King Xerxes, and he said, "There is a certain race of people scattered all through the provinces of your empire who keep themselves separate from everyone else. Their laws are different from those of any other people, and they refuse to obey the laws of the king. So it is not in the king's best interest to let them live. If it please the king, issue a decree that they be destroyed, and I will give 10,000 large sacks of silver to the government administrators to be deposited in the royal treasury. He's willing to pay to have them annihilated. So King Xerxes, remember, he's not a good man. He agrees. The date is set as March 7th. The decree was written. It was sealed with the signet ring. It was a law. And all the Jews, men, women, and children, were set to be annihilated on March 7th. Now, when Mordecai heard about this, he tore his clothes. He put on burlap and ashes. He was in mourning. And he went every day to the outside of the palace, outside of the empire there. He went every day and he was mourning. He was crying out. And the Jews were mourning because here they were. They were taken forcibly from the land that they lived in. Their king that they were living under was not a God-fearing king. They were in this place as refugees, and now they're going to be executed. They had nowhere to go. They had no safe haven. They had no protection. Their circumstances looked like God had forgotten them. Their circumstances looked like God broke his promises. You know, do you ever find yourselves in the middle of a circumstance and you feel like God broke his promise? Mordecai got word to Queen Esther and he asked for her help. But you all probably know the story. The queen had a problem. Chapter 4, verse 11. She said, all the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited in is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. See, Queen Esther had a problem. Just because she's queen, just because she's his wife, she can't go into the inner courts without him inviting her in. If she does, it could mean death. And then we hear Mordecai's very famous plea in verse 13. He says, don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. But you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this. Now, I know we all like that last sentence, but what stands out to me the most, again, is Mordecai and the faith that he had. He had enough faith to know that if Esther said no, that God was going to raise up another to save his people. He had enough faith to know that maybe God wouldn't save him. Maybe he wouldn't even save Esther. And maybe he wouldn't save all the people in the empire. But he was going to raise up another. He was always going to have a remnant because Mordecai knew the Jewish nation would never die. He knew that. So they're willing to lay down their own lives. But they know that Jewish nation is never going to die. Now, how did he know that? He knew that because he knew the promises that were passed down from Abraham. He knew the promises that God gave Abraham, that the descendants would go on and on and on, and that even if he had to die, the nation was not going to. And we know it won't, because it's here at the end of time. You see, it was years since he walked the streets of Jerusalem, but he believed and he hung on to the promises of God, and he is the one who passed that faith on to Queen Esther. He raised her. How are you raising your kids? This is a good lesson in how we raise our children. We have to pass our faith on to our children. And then we see on verse 16, still in chapter 4, Esther says, "Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and my maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die." You see, Mordecai and Queen Esther, they knew that God was going to eventually deal with Haman. They could have gotten angry and tried to avenge him themselves. But the Lord tells us in Deuteronomy 32:35, "I will take revenge," he says. "I will pay them back. In due time, their feet are going to slip, and their day of disaster will arrive, and their destiny will overtake them." You see, oftentimes when we're wronged, we like to take matters into our own hands, but it's better to leave room for the wrath of God because he knows how to deal with it. He knows the outcome. And that is what Queen Esther was doing in this story. She was saying, "I'm going to fast and pray. I'm going to prepare myself. I'm going to make myself available." But the outcome's going to be up to God. This amazing story continues with Queen Esther. After 3 days of fasting and prayer, she puts on her royal robes. She puts on her crown, and she enters into that inner chamber, the inner chamber, and the king is sitting on his throne, and he sees her. And I'd imagine she's probably shaking. And he holds out his gold scepter. And she comes and she touches the very end of it. She's safe. And he asks her what she wants. And she simply requests he and Haman's presence at a banquet that night in her quarters. Remember what we said Queen Xerxes likes to do? He likes to drink, he likes to eat, and he likes to party. She's playing right in to what he enjoys, and she's inviting him into a banquet. So he comes, and Haman comes, and the very next, that night, he says, what do you want? He asks her again, and again she says, "I want to invite you and Haman to a banquet tomorrow." She puts him off, and she says, "Tomorrow, the next day." Now, why didn't the queen just tell him what she wanted? You know, me, I would have been like, "Well, I'm just telling you what I want," you know. But no, she didn't. She knew. She knew that the providence of God was at work. And she knew that sometimes it's better to be silent than it is to speak. And let God do his work. Because you see, something really important had to happen first. So that night, the king's in his chambers, he's sleeping, and he has trouble to sleep. So when a king has trouble to sleep, they call for their attendant to come and read to them. And the attendant is reading to them out of a book that's called The History of His Reign. He wanted to hear the history of his own reign. So that's what he's being read to. And during that reading, he remembers that there was an attempted assassination on his life, and some man by the name of Mordecai that works there saved him. And he said, "Did we ever honor Mordecai?" And the attendant says, "No." And he said, "Well, we need to honor him." So the next day, the highest official, Haman, comes into work. And the king says, "Haman, come here. How would you honor someone, or how should the king honor someone? You know, what should I do if the king wants to honor someone," basically. And Haman's like, oh my goodness, he's going to honor me. Remember, that's how he was. He's going to honor me. Yay. And Haman says, "Well, put a royal robe on him and put him on the king's horse and parade him all through the city for everyone to see. And say, 'This is what the king does for someone he wants to honor. This is what the king does for someone he wants to honor,' and just keep shouting that." And Mordecai said, King Xerxes said, "Very well. Go and do that for Mordecai." Oh. At this point in the story, I got to confess, I feel a little sorry for Haman, because here he is. He has to honor the man that he can't stand. Wow. See, Mordecai, like I said, was a man of God. The book should be called the Book of Mordecai. He was a man of God because he saved the king's life, even though the king took his adoptive daughter. He saved him even though he was an ungodly leader. He honored him. And God didn't let this story end without Haman having to honor Mordecai. The lesson for that in us is God will honor those who honor others. Now, at the banquet the next day, the king asked Esther what she wanted and turned to chapter 7, beginning at verse 3. Here's her reply. She says, "If I have found favor with the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request, I ask that my life and the lives of my people will be spared. For my people and I have been sold to those who would kill, slaughter, and annihilate us. If we had merely been sold as slaves, I could remain quiet, for that would be too trivial of a matter to warrant disturbing the king." "Who would do such a thing?" King Xerxes demanded. "Who would be so presumptuous as to touch you?" Esther replied, "This wicked Haman is our adversary and our enemy." And Haman grew pale, the Bible says, with fright before the king and the queen. And then the king jumped to his feet in a rage and he went out to the palace garden. It was too much for him. Haman, however, stayed behind because he was pleading for his life with the queen because he knew that the king intended to kill him. And in despair, he fell on the couch where the queen was reclining, just as the king was returning from the palace garden. And the king exclaimed, "Will he even assault the queen right here in the palace before my very eyes?" And as soon as the king spoke, the attendants covered Haman's face, signaling his doom. Haman was going to be put to death. And he was. He was put to death on the 8-foot tall gallows that he intended for Mordecai. And then the king gave the property of Haman to Queen Esther, who appointed Mordecai in charge of it. And the king gave Mordecai the signet ring that he had taken from Haman and placed it on Mordecai. And then we see the queen falling down at the king's feet in tears, and she was begging him to reverse the orders. Now remember, whatever's sealed with that signet ring is a law, and it can't be reversed. So the king did something different. He gave Mordecai permission to write a brand new law and seal it with the ring. So Mordecai dictated the decree, giving the Jews in every city authority to unite and defend their lives. They were allowed to kill and slaughter and annihilate anyone of any nationality or province who came against them and would attack them. And furthermore, they were allowed to take the property of them. The day chosen for the event was the exact same day as the earlier decree, March 7th. On March 7th, these 2 decrees went into effect. What happened was the Jews overpowered their enemies, and no one could stand against them. The Bible tells us that everyone was afraid of them. And to this day, Jews everywhere, they celebrate an annual festival known as the Festival of Purim. And this year, it is on February 26th. It's coming up. And what they'll do is they'll go into their synagogues and they'll read the story of Esther. And every time that the name of Haman is spoken, it sounds fun because they'll go boo and hiss, and they kind of boo and they hiss. I think kids would love it. And then the second time they'll read it. And that time, it's quiet. They don't boo and hiss because that time they're reading it in the reverence of the Lord, and they are recognizing everything that He did for them to help them gain relief from their enemies. And they remember a time where their sorrows were turned to gladness and their mourning was turned to joy. It sounds like a fun festival. So what do we learn from this story of Esther? I love the story of Esther, and there's so many areas that I could have taken with this. There's so much in it. But the main thing that I want us to remember from this story today is the story of Esther is a love story. It's a love story where God shows his people that he has not forgotten them. He has not deserted them. And he always has a plan. You know, if we think that our society and our culture is messed up, or if we think that we live under ungodly leadership, just looking at this book of Esther shows us that even in a culture that doesn't value righteousness, and even under leaders who don't value God, God is still at work for his people. He is still at work in our lives, and we can trust him with the plan that he has. Because again, God is working everything for our good and for his glory. He works in the smallest of details to bring about his plan for our lives and for his glory. You know, sometimes we find ourselves right smack in the middle of the storm. Or we find ourselves right smack in the middle of the illness, in the middle of the tragedy, in the middle of the situation, and we can't see our way out. We can't see it because the circumstances, they look bad and they look scary. But we cannot judge the outcome by the circumstance. There's a story that's told of a man, and he was shipwrecked on an island. And he decided to build himself some shelter, so he gathered up some things on the island to build himself a small shelter and made a little fire. And every day he would go out and he would look at that horizon in hopes that a ship was coming to get him. Every day, day after day after day. And there wasn't any coming. And one day he left his little fire burning and he went out on the island to search for food. And when he came back, his little fire caught his shelter on fire. And it was all gone. It was all gone. And he fell down in despair and he said, I can't do it anymore. I've been here so long. I don't have the energy to go out and build another shelter. I don't have the energy to keep doing this. I'm done. I'm done. And he laid down and he was giving up. And in his despair, he fell asleep. And when he woke to the face of a captain right in his face. And he said, Sir, we saw your smoke signal and we're here to rescue you. You see, we can't judge the outcome by the circumstance. For Queen Esther and Mordecai and all the Jews in Persia, their circumstances were dire. You know, they were facing death. They were facing death. Men, women, and children, all of them in that land. But the outcome was going to be amazing. It was going to be amazing. Have you ever noticed that God loves to show up when things are their darkest? He loves it. When the Israelites were under Egyptian slavery, God showed up. When Gideon only had 100 men to defeat the enemy army, God showed up. When Joseph, he was sold into slavery, he was thrown into the prison, things were pretty dire for Joseph. But God, he was working all things out for good. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were thrown into that fiery furnace, but God showed up because they didn't even smell of smoke. It wasn't even on their clothing. Young David stood before giant Goliath, and God showed up. Daniel was in the lion's den. God was in there too. He showed up. And it's the same for us today. It is the exact same for us. God is at work for us. He was at work in Esther and Mordecai's life, and he is at work in ours. God says in Isaiah 55:8 that my ways are far beyond anything you can imagine. For just as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. And my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. You know, God has a plan. He has a plan. And it is for your good and for his glory. Right now, God's writing our stories of our lives. He's writing our stories. And I ask you today, do you trust him to write it? Do you trust him to write your story? Can you stand in the middle of your circumstances, in the middle of what you're going through, and can you say, you know, my eyes, they can't see, and my ears, they sometimes can't hear, and my heart, sometimes my heart, it fails me, and my emotions, they tell me something completely different, but my God and my rock, my Jehovah Lord, he stands. He's there, and his promises are for good. His promises are sure, and his promises are strong. You see, the promises of God, they're going to stand for all of eternity. God's not a man. He doesn't lie. That's what the Bible tells us. We may make promises to people. We'll say, well, we'll be there. Yeah, I'll be there. Yeah, I'll pray for you. That's not how God's promises are. God's promises are leave no doubt, rock solid kind of promises. They do not fail. For me, I cling to the promise that God is never going to leave me. He's never going to forsake me. He is for me, not against me. And he has good planned for my life. And right now, he's in heaven, and he is preparing a place for me that's amazing. And one of these days, he's going to come back, and he's going to get me. And we're going to be together forever. And all things are going to be new. All things. I'm going to open the altar. I told Pastor Eldon, I promised God that whenever I spoke, I'd always have an altar call. I can't go back on that. If you need renewed hope to believe God for a promise, I'm going to ask you to come forward. If you need hope to trust God to write your story, I'm going to ask you to come forward. You can pray, be alone with God, or put your hand up and I'll pray with you. I know there's some of you here that need prayer. Finally, I want to say, if you're sitting here and you're like, well, I don't know if the promises of God are for me because I don't really know if I'm a child of God. And if you feel that little tugging at your heart, that's God. That's God, and he's saying, get up there. The Bible tells us today is the day of salvation. You know, Esther said, if I die, I die. The Bible tells us that there's no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends, and that's what Jesus did for us. He laid down his life because he loves us that much. And he wants to forgive us and heal us and set us free, redeem us, and he wants us with him in heaven forever and ever and ever. So if you're sitting there and you're like, I don't know, then come forward and I'll pray with you. Today's the day. Tomorrow can be too late. You know, the promises of God are for all of God's children. 2 Corinthians 1:20 says, "For all of God's promises have been fulfilled in Christ with a resounding yes. Yes. And through Christ, our amen ascends to God for his glory." We need to live trusting God's plan for our lives. And I ask today, do you trust him? Do you trust God to write your story? He is working things in you today that is for your good and for his glory tomorrow.